It's in the second article. Do you know what word it is?
They resell. They resell it.
Okay, after the articles, yeah. I want to go through that, Bezra Hashem. Okay. Okay, so first we'll start off by thanking the Elizabeth and Baz Meir of Parnas Hayom today for the 40th Yortzeit Boy Bayom for Leon Meir, Harav Yehuda Aryeh ben Harav Shlomo Yisrael Nishmasei Eden. Shama should have an aliyah. He should continue to get nachas from expanding mishpacha always. And a special mazel tov and happy birthday, Chazak v'ematz to Rabbi Steinmetz. And so Hashem, many, many more good and happy and healthy birthdays, Be'ezras Hashem. God willing. So this is I wanted to expand upon a topic I started recently, and I talked about this a little bit at sort of Shlishis a week before, but I want to just expand a little bit more than we started there, and this is the topic of authorship of the Torah. It started by an article which actually was given to me by Ben Heller. He came over to me and he gave me a Times of Israel article about a new algorithm. The topic, the name of the article is "Who Wrote the Bible? A Pioneering New Algorithm That May Shatter Scholarly Certitude." Very interesting article, and so it actually refers to an academic article which was written in the Plus One magazine. It does sound like a little bit of an Israeli magazine, right? But actually, it stands for something. So it's an academic journal which has an article on this particular topic about a new method about studying the Bible that looks at the statistics of word usage using a lemma principle of quantifying word usages in different texts. But just to have a little bit of background, because this we didn't get a chance to really do in greater depth. Here's the deal. Let's start at the beginning. This really all starts, this is not new business. This starts with a discussion which is had in the 1800s already. You see, in the 1800s, there was an explosion of academic study in all forms and in all fashions. And part of this academic study discussed so many different things, archaeological studies. There was studies about the cosmos. There were studies about biology. There were so many things that were going on during the 1800s. It was the era of grand theories where everybody was trying to figure everything out that explained everything. And to a large degree, some were successful. Some have been rejected and more nuanced today. But like as an example, that's when the theory of evolution. This explains all of life's origins. We have Freud is going to be just a little bit later. Is going to talk about what drives human beings, right? We have all these large scale theories, and it's a time where there's a lot of archaeological evidence and a lot of research into original documentation, and people are trying to find out, where did things come from? How did this all arrive? That became the question at hand, and so. There was a fellow called Julius Wellhausen, who was a German researcher, and he said, well, let's do the same thing to the Bible. Let's try to look at the Torah through the same lens. And what he did was he noticed, and it wasn't just him, there was many people before him, but he noticed that there was inconsistencies in the Torah, right? And anybody who's spent any time learning Torah notices this. This is not as if anybody discovered America. But nonetheless, there are inconsistencies in the Torah. As an example, there's many recountings of certain stories. So, as an example, the description of creation appears twice, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and it's in a slightly different order, and one leaves out a significant amount of the information, and then it describes male and female completely differently, and the point of creation is described quite differently in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Then you have things like, as an example, you have the Aseres HaDibros. So Hashem gives the Aseres HaDibros, and yet the Aseres HaDibros are presented 2 times. One time and another time it's presented with a very different background, right? There's so many different ways that are described. The reason for keeping Shabbos is different in the different Aseres HaDibros. So people say, wait a second, like all of these things. Then if you go to Sefer Devarim, you have all these descriptions of things that have happened already, right? So we have the Meraglim episode rehashed. We have all these things. We have the Egel Azov rehashed. And it's described differently in the second version. So in the realm of great human arrogance and trying to make sure that everything comes together, Wellhausen suggested what is known today as documentary hypothesis. It's again like a hypothesis, and I'll start off by saying it's absolute kfira, right? So it's complete heresy. So let's not make sure that just to start off at that point. But he said that there must have been four different authors to the Torah, right? By the way, I always hesitate. Is it worth learning about these topics and delving into this? So is it worth even delving into this? And I believe that for the most part, no. I mean, like there's so much Torah to study without going into all of this. But it happens to be that that I read through this article, and it's for people who perhaps are reading this on an average day-to-day basis, it'll raise questions and eyebrows, and they say, "Wait a second, how does this work precisely?" And I'd like to debunk some of those observations. So let's start over there. So he goes off and he says, "Look, there were different human authors of the Torah. Right? So that's already divergent from Judaism, from traditional Judaism. So he says there must have been different authors, and there were two different texts of Torah which were later sewn together, one from the southern kingdom and one from the northern kingdom of Israel. The one from the southern kingdom can be identified wherever it uses the name of God, which is Yud Kei Vav Kei. Shem Havaya, and the one of the northern kingdom is Elokim, right? And you see this throughout the Torah that sometimes it's Yud Kei Vav Kei, sometimes it's Shem Elokim, and that's because there were different authors. There was the southern kingdom, which was more Yud Kei Vav Kei. That's where they were more spiritual or holy, and the northern kingdom was more about administration and Elokim. And so that's what he calls J-E, right? J is the Yud Kei Vav Kei, E is Elokim. Good. And then he says, but there's like another part as well, which also kind of doesn't fit into this framework. And that is like we'll call all the korbanos and the tabernacles and all that stuff, which, like a significant part of the end of that, a part of Shmois and most of Vayikra. So he says that was what's called P. Priestly Kohanim. The Kohanim presented and created that part, and that was later on sewn in. And then finally, the last part he said was there's another part version which is called D, which is Deuteronomy. Devarim has its own style and is completely different from the other styles, and therefore he says there must be four different authors who came at four different times, and then one redactor kind of put all these different versions together, and we have JEPD, which is the documentary hypothesis. We have four authors putting it together, human authors putting it together. There are different centuries. He makes the arguments as to when the different parts were released, and it's all put together. And in the academic world, this held water for over a century. So, it's 1870s or so for a full century plus. And today there's lots of questions on documentary hypothesis, just from academic standpoints. Lots of people don't agree with what you said or proposed or thought of. But there are different versions. So some people added a fifth author. Some people took away a fourth author. Now there's only three authors. So this brings us to this research. So what does this research do? This research says like this. Let's try to prove this through an algorithm. So they said like this. Okay, where they're going to work, the framework they're working with is a later version of the sources, which means to say that it's not Wellhausen. Wellhausen has been debunked. But the general idea is that there are three authors that they were human authors that they're working with, right? So they are working with what's called D, DT, and P. It's very similar to the idea, because the idea that it's Shem Havaya and Elokim. I mean, there's so many problems with that theory. I mean, it fits very neatly if you think about it. But you start reading the Torah, it doesn't work, right? You just need to read the text a little bit. So they rejected that part of that, but they said, well, look, Deuteronomy, it seems to be its own thing, because it's a very different word usages, different themes, different topics. And then there's Deuteronomic history, which is sort of like Sefer Yoshua to Melachem, which seems to be in the same style but different to Devarim. And then there's P, which is really Shmois and Vayikra, which is the priestly part of it. And they said if we put all that together, that's generally one of the accepted academic consensus today. Again, if you call consensus one group of people who say one thing who others disagree with. Okay, so I said like this. Well, let's take the part that most people agree with. Again, how do you get to what most academics agree with when it changes every decade? But they said, well, let's take it and let's put it through a word. Let's divide up the words, create a lemmagram where we're going to essentially give a rating of the usage of each word, create tables of how many words are used and the frequency of those words, and compare each of the different distinct sections and the frequency of word usages. And we'll be able to show that, in fact, it's not the same author through this, right? So this is what the one thing they wanted to do. And so what they did was they took the minimal amount of Deuteronomy, which is a few chapters in Devarim to be safe, then Deuteronomy history, which is the other chapters in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, and Yeshua to Malachim, which I have a lot of. And then it takes take a section in Vayikra and then measure it, and they show that behold, the fingerprint, we'll call the linguistic fingerprint, is different, right? So just to understand what that means, that means to say is that when a human being writes, a human being uses certain words more than others and uses only certain types of vocabulary different to other people. And whether we know this or we don't know this is what we do as human beings. And so they're essentially saying is, look, the word patterns, the word frequency, word usage is completely disparate. And then they said, well, now taking that, let's try to apply that to the rest of all the questionable places in Tanakh. So they said, like as an example, they went through Deuteronomy 4, Leviticus 28, the two ark incidents in Sefer Shmuel, Divrei Yamim, Chronicles of Avram, the Pelagish Begiva story, the Esther, Mishlei. They try to say, well, let's now look at those from the prism of these three categories of author, and then they said now we can attribute as to whether this was authored by one of those authors or not. That's the way they're doing it, right? So this is all we'll call higher criticism, which means higher kfira, right? So heresy, just to clarify what we're doing over here. But this is the argument, and they've shown this to be the case. Some cases they'll say it's an author that we don't know, but sometimes they'll say no, this was actually later on the other author. So just to quote and we'll end with the Kira right now, but just to quote one of the researchers, Israel Finkelstein, who's one of the folks on this, he says, as far as I can judge, the earliest text in the Bible composed in the Kingdom of Israel in the first half of the 8th century BCE. And he says composition of text intensified in the 7th century BC in Judah, mainly in the days of King Yoshio. He told the Times of Israel via email the latest texts were put into writing around the 2nd century BCE, right? So essentially the way that he views it, and these academics view it, is that some group of human beings were kind of writing this all retroactively, meaning now writing their history retroactively about this is what happened, and that's why there's different authors, and it was all sewn together, and hence we have Tanakh, and we can prove this now statistically. So just a few things which are worthwhile noting is that this type of idea of n-gram or lemmagram method of using of looking at text is something which has been used in multiple times. So just an interesting example of it, and then I'd like to do some learning just to point out the deficiencies in this in a second. But one very fascinating observation, I mentioned this before, is a book which came out in 2013 called The Cuckoo's Calling by a new author called Robert Galbraith. And it was doing all right. It wasn't such a, it wasn't like a huge smash success. But the Sunday Times in England felt that they had a suspicion that he was not in fact who he was, right? And part of what gave it away to them was that the agent and the publisher were the same agent and publisher who presented the books of Harry Potter. So what they did was they employed two statisticians from different universities to do a word frequency analysis of this book and compare it to various other books of the genre. And so they did it, and they came out proving that in fact it was none other than J.K. Rowling. And when they presented this research, she came out of the closet the next day and said that in fact it was her. And of course, and just to quote the article, less than 24 hours after Harry Potter creator was unmasked, sales of the books rose 415,000% on Amazon. From selling only 1,500 hardback copies in May, the novel catapulted from number 4,159 on the website's fiction bestseller to the number 1 spot. Right, so it clearly was a very good marketing strategy. And the book took off, and there's a TV shows now on the Cuckoo's Nest with multiple series TV show on this particular topic, and this was all done using the same idea, which means to say if you go to where I first found out about this is there's a museum in Washington D.C. called the Museum of the Word, which is really a great museum, really well done, very engaging for kids and adults. and has good rates. It's a donation suggested. So, but if you're large families, you're paying $25 a person. It's a very significant outing, right? But nonetheless, so you go to the museum, and they said that they argue on this particular revelation of authorship that it was her usage of the word the even. I just understand how crazy this is how she used her prepositions. You don't even realize how many times you and when you use your prepositions. It was matched her writing elsewhere in Harry Potter, and that was how they figured it out, right? So that's the suggestion. So it's been something which has been shown to be effective in, say, the secular world, and it's now been applied to the Torah, and so now it's in a certain sense it reflects the reality that they're talking about. So just a few points. First of all, with the Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, before we get any further, is there's a number of papers written on showing that this was not the method they use is not so foolproof. In looking at her research, there are two researchers, and there's a debate as to whether this is how close was the reading. Meaning, first of all, what books did you choose to compare her to? Was it a male writer or a female writer? Meaning, they chose just to compare it to another 2 or 3 books, right? So was it a detective novel, or was it or like this was, or was it another genre? Number 2 is, was it a male or a female that you're comparing to, which rendered the results that you were trying to find? And number 3 is, if you look at the statistical analysis of the tables of the words, we're not talking about like front runner. We're talking about like, a second runner in 2 of the experiments. And they said, well, this is enough. And to be honest, I believe that J.K. Rowling was just waiting to step out of that closet, because although she claimed that it was it was very liberating to be able to write without the pressure of having her name and going into a new genre of detective novels. Clearly, she wanted her book to sell, and it worked, right? So, meaning to say, she didn't need to have empirical research for her to make the great reveal, to make a book catapult to #1 on Amazon, right? Meaning to say, this was not the greatest form of academic research. Now, number 1, just to put things a little further, but the truth is that this methodology, and with the great amount of hubris and research that has been done, it's important just to come back to basics for a second. So just remember important thing to remember is that the Rambam writes at the beginning of the 10th parak of Sanhedrin in the Mishnayos, in his Pirush Mishnayos. The Mishnah says, "Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek l'olam haba." That's the good news, right? So all Jews have a portion of the world to come. Shenemar ameh kulam tzadikim l'olam yushu aretz. This is just wonderful, right? And then the Mishnah says, and there's a few folks who've kind of, they lost their ticket, right? So the Mishnah gives 3 examples. Right? A person is who denies God, Torah min hashamayim, and a person who's apikoros. Sorry, it's tchias hamesim, Torah min hashamayim, and apikoros, denies God. On that mission, the Rambam formulates expanding those 3 categories of people who lose their tickets to the world to come. The Rambam goes on to talk about the idea of what's called what he calls the principles of faith. There's certain things that if you don't believe in, you've lost your ticket to the Olam Haba. He expands each of those 3 categories. He expands them. So belief in God includes 5 sections. That's what he does, and that's the first 5 of Ikarim. Then the next section of Torah min hashamayim has 4 sections. That's Ikar Vav to Tes. Then the last idea of Tchias HaMesim, reward and punishment, has 4 subsections, which is the Ikarim of Yud to Yud Gimel. And if you read through the Yud Gimel Ikarim, you'll see that that's how he formulates it. Great. The 8th of those Ikarim, which is pretty much an exact derivation from the what the Mishnah says itself, is the Rambam says in the Mishnayos, in the Pirush Mishnayos, in the source 2, on page 4, he says, "Ayisod hashmini hu Torah ben hashamayim, v'hu shenamin shekol haTorah hazu hanintzas biyadenu hayom hazeh haTorah shenitna leMoshe." With the Torah that we have is the Torah which was given to Moses. V'shehi kulam mipi agvura. It is all from the Almighty. Klamar shehigia olav kulam eis Hashem hagaa shekorin oisal derech hashala dibur. Hakadosh Baruch Hu formulated, dictated it in the form of words, and it was redacted to writing exactly as he said it. In fact, we just had it yesterday with the base of Medrash Minyan, where there was a mistake that was found in 1 letter in the Torah. What do we do in such situations? We put away that Torah until it's fixed. We're so careful about every word, every letter, the way the Torah is treated. ואין ידוע איכוס עושה הגו אלו הוא עניין השלום אשר הגיע אליו. And then he goes on to say in the fifth line, ואין הבדל בין ובני חם כושו מצרים ופוש וכנען ושם אשתו מטאבל בס מטרד. And there's no difference between we'll call it the genealogical studies in the Torah describing the extra family relatives of Yishmael and Esav. So the most fundamental aspects of belief in the Torah is no different to even the family members of Yishmael's extended family when it comes to the value of every letter from the Torah. That's what the Rambam says as well. So first of all, even the suggestion, the arrogance of a human being to say, well, there must be multiple authors or humans, that you've stepped out of tradition. If you believe that, I'm sorry, Dr. Finkelstein. You ain't like Chelek L'Olam Haba. That's what the Rambam says, and that's Torah Min HaShamayim. And you can debate the Rambam's Yigrim Karim from today until tomorrow, but you can't debate the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says a person is kofer min Torah Min HaShamayim. That's exactly word for word what the Rambam is saying in the 8th Ikar. That's Ein Lo Chelek L'Olam Haba. And the Rambam will just go so far as to say a person who uses it as Safek, Ein Lo Chelek L'Olam Haba. That's a big step. But the person who believes that Torah is not Min HaShamayim, that you have no you may practice Judaism, you may do the parts that you like, but that's not Judaism, right? You've now no longer, your Judaism is no longer built on the foundation of what Judaism is meant to be, and that's gone. So just to understand that fundamentally we can't go there. And if in case you think, well, over time, things are different. Rav Moshe Feinstein was reflecting on a comment that was made. Nigros Moshe was asked a comment that was made about a commentary which was related to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid about a certain part in the Torah where it describes, actually in the next week's parasha, it describes the bed of Og Melech HaBashan, and it's Arsa Eres Barzel, and goes and describes his bed, and it describes the measurements based on the Amasa Ish, and there's a comment that really maybe that wasn't, how could Moshe Rabbeinu know, and did he really see this? So maybe it was somebody else to add that in afterwards, to add in the measurements to help us understand this. And so he was asked, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked about this, and he says, in source 3, this is just he wrote 2 chuvas, and this is a very short section of it. Al kol ponim, kol hasefer Torah, kula nistav al yedei Moshe mipia gvura, kol ois mamish, every letter, even of Dvarim, umishu omer she'irka afilu rak ois achas shekos of Moshe ba'atzmo hu koifer b'Torah ubichlal ki davar Hashem bazah. That a person who says that even one letter was just written by Moshe is rejecting Hashem. Just understand what he's saying here. He's not saying that you're suggesting somebody else wrote it. He's saying to suggest that Moshe Rabbeinu himself wrote it. Meaning, to think that Moshe Rabbeinu added anything to what Hashem said to him, that itself is already infringement of this. Forget that or anybody else, any other human beings. He says, "V'kol shekain mi sheyama sheikar ez davar she'af Moshe la kaslo ela acherim o sheba acherim v'echziru ze min haTorah shem kovrim b'Torah b'chlal davar Hashem hazah." He says that you've gone too far. That's not acceptable within the parameters of traditional Judaism. So then the question becomes well, how do you account for all this stuff? There's a lot of questions. So first of all, this is not the first time we're talking about this. So many books written on this. So for instance, Umberto Rabbi Casuto wrote an extensive response to documentary hypothesis, as did Rabbi Yehuda Elitzur and Dr. Mordechai Breuer. So meaning to say, like, if you want to go into the notion of multiple authorship, there are extensive books that are written on this. If you want to go into Dr. Breuer's writing, he's got scrolls called Shitat HaBeinayim, where he has a very sophisticated response to how the Torah has multiple voices as well. If you're interested in doing a little more reading in this, this is a book which actually came out very recently by Dr. Josh Berman. It's called Ani Ma'amin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Faith, Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith. It's really excellent, and he deals with this extensively. Let's just appreciate some of the arguments, and then we'll come back to this for a moment as well. So I just want to extend this a little bit for a moment. So here we go. The first most critical issue is, there's so many issues with this idea, with this idea in the first place. Both the idea of multiple authorship and then also the statistical proof of it are both completely are fallacious assumptions. Number one is before we even get to the points I put over here, but is like this: is what was the agenda of the redactor? right? So let's say like this. Let's say, like this Dr. Finkelstein argues, that there's the Jews are living in Israel. There's Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom, 7th century BCE, whatever it is, and they're now trying to create a mythological history for themselves, right? So this group writes this part, and a little bit later they're out this part in the 2nd century BC. Another group writes this part, and then you sort of sew it all together, and boom, now we have Jewish history, right? Written in a biblical fashion, and now we all have our own history, just like the rest of the pagans. So, if that's the situation that's happening, then so like let's think about the redactor for a second, right? So comes along the redactor who has these different traditions or different writings about different events in Jewish history, right? So like what's his agenda? So you say, well, no, the redactor puts it all together. He wants it to be that Jews are all going to believe in the same general history and mythology. So, then he did a really bad job, right? Because if he was a canny person, he would have clearly picked up on the fact that these are different words, different versions of history, and many differences. So, what he should have done, if he was really clever, what he should have done was he should have taken those texts and smoothed them over, rewritten them, right? Rewritten them, incorporating most of them. And by the way, in Christianity, they did this with the Gospels, right? Later on. There was different versions of Yoshka's life, so you write it all together as if it's one thing, right? You don't put it together, what? It's still doing a great job. But I'm saying, but the point is that come later and try to make it coherent. But just to sort of cut and paste, and it's not just cut and paste. It's cut and paste in different, between different chapters, in mid chapters, sometimes mid sukkim if you want to actually be honest, right? So I mean, like, so now you're putting this all together. What's the agenda? Like, let's give an example right now. So we have different versions of history in Tanakh. What's the most classic example? Divrei Yamim, right? Chronicles. So Divrei Yamim covers the same era, covers from creation, but let's exclude the generations for a second, the first 12 chapters of Divrei Yamim Aleph. But now let's say we're going to take it from the kingdom of leading to David HaMelech till the destruction and a little bit post. That's covered in Melachim, and really Shmuel leading to Melachim, and Divrei Yamim does the same thing, right? So this is not new. So, but we know what the agenda is. Meaning it's like this. We know that the agenda of the author of Divrei Yamim, the prophet who is rendering Divrei Yamim, was to focus on Malchus, base, David, right? Which is why there are certain episodes which are missing. So we don't have David and Bat Sheva as an example in Divrei Yamim, whereas we do have it in Melachim. We have a focus more on the southern kingdom than we have the northern kingdom, which is why there's certain stories which are there which don't appear in Melachim, right? So you know what the agenda is of the author. So here he is. He's looking at the same history, but he's telling it to us. The prophet is telling us what the history is, but they're giving us, and we understand the agenda. It all matches. It all adds up. But who's this author over here? If you have a redactor trying to put this all together, what precisely are they doing? Like, why was it certain stories that got included, certain stories got excluded? Why certain stories got repeated? Why did you sew it together in such a way, in such a haphazard way where it doesn't make sense? And there's obvious. I mean, like, let's say two different authors wrote about a creation. So you're like, what? You copy and paste them next to each other? It's ridiculous. Do you not see that they don't match each other? It doesn't take much of a scholar to read the two Aseres Dibros and realize that they actually say slightly different things. One says Zachor, one says Shamor, one says Lo Sisave, the other one says Lo Sachmor. You don't have to be a scholar to read this. You don't have to be a scholar to realize that the reason for Shabbos in number 1 and number 2 is different, right? So what are you going to do? You're the redactor, and you're trying to get people to drink your Kool-Aid. You want to make yours the bestseller of all time, which it is, right? So you want to do that. So you just put it all together haphazard. Like, you need a little bit more scholarships, and we call literary acumen if you want to be selling that, right?
Pay hard to work.
Right. Well, it's been long. I'm saying that, and never, but come on, really. But there's more than this as well. There's other questions, which is like this. You would assume that, let's say there was different versions of like we'll call Jewish history floating around based on different authors. You would expect at some point in history that let's say you are a greatly charismatic person and you managed to put it all together and you made the Bible, right? So you're it, right? And you're trying to sell this now to everybody else. So like, come on, there's definitely going to be some purist out there who's not going to accept your work, right? And that purist probably comes from the P camp, the D camp, the J camp, or whatever you want to call the author that you decided. So that group of people are not drinking your Kool-Aid. They don't want to buy your book. They've got the book they think is purely the Bible. So you would expect at some point in history that there should be a Bible floating around here, or some documentation of a Bible which is only one author, right? Meaning you should have the Bible of P, right? There should be somebody who believes just in the end of Shmos and Vayikra, and that should be their Bible. And they don't believe in the guy who redacted and added stuff. We don't have anybody who says that. Never before has there been a document which was found which only one part of it. I mean, say this, there is no single author Bible according to this as well, which is ridiculous. How is it possible that only this version, which is still holding to posterity in terms of word count and the same language, is the same, almost letter for letter, right? We have 4 discrepancies. But how could it be that everybody has the same Bible that this redactor had and nobody had the earlier versions? That's ridiculous. That's academically preposterous that doesn't exist. There would have been one camp which would have lost as well. Now, but more than that, it's like, do you think that Wellhausen or all these people discovered these inaccuracies? Like, do you think that we waited until the 1800s to figure out that Aseret Dibros has 2 versions? What are you talking about? Read the Mefarshim. Read Chazal. They knew all about this. The Ibn Ezra gives a list of all the differences between the Aseret and Dibros. The Malbim explains every single one of them. Right? Chazal tell us, Zachav Shama B'Dibur Echad Emru, and there's a halachic ramification of this. Masha Lo Yachol Ozno Shel Adam Rad Dishmoya. They knew about these things. You think that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 nobody knew about it? I mean, there's books written on this. The Lonely Man of Faith. Rabbi Soloveitchik's book is simply about Bereshis 1 and Bereshis 2 and the 2 different versions of Adam to create the complexity of 2 parts of the human character. Come on, like, do you really think that because you found different styles, there's new authors? Is it not possible for it to be a multiple, more complex system of thought as well? And I would also point out this to me is like such a there's so many other things as well. Just if you read Rav Berman's book, there's really excellent observations as well. Why would the D author, as an example, why would Devarim, the Deuteronomy, only choose certain stories to repeat? Like, why is Meraglim and Cheta Egel? There's a whole bunch. Let's say you are writing a new history for a people and you want people to buy it. Like, why are those stories? What are the rest? Why isn't your Shur repeated? Like, why not that section, right? Why not why are you choosing? In fact, it's very clear in Sefer Devarim, as we're beginning this week, that Sefer Devarim relies upon the knowledge of the other 4 books of the Torah, right? Meaning it's clear from the author's intent that he knows you know the rest of it, and he is building upon that. So, like, you would write your own thing. You would not take any assumptions. You're writing a new document, right? I mean, the whole thing is fallacious and smacks of incredible hubris from the human perspective. In fact, and there's a lot of other points to raise, but this to me is the greatest point, and I just which I just think it's so incredible that people are sort of speak out 2 sides of their mouth for this as well. Is I had the opportunity when I was in college to study a number of different courses. I came from a place where it was not about it is not liberal arts. Where I grew up, you do a degree, you get qualified in what you do, and you specialize and you get your engineering degree, and then you come to America and everybody's doing liberal arts, right? So for 4 years, you kind of figure out what you're doing. At the beginning, I was very disillusioned by this ridiculous waste of time. But then I actually gained a lot from it. I really gained a tremendous amount doing liberal arts education. So I got a BA rather than a BS, right? A BSc, that's what they call it. BSc is Bachelor of Science, right? And so here in America, you get a BA, a Bachelor of Arts, right? Before you go any further, right? So I gained so much. I learned economics, and I learned psychology, and I learned English literature, and I learned Hebrew language academically, not just like the way that you think you learned it in Cheder, right? Really, how does the language work? Like, there's a lot of things, Bible. There's a lot of stuff that I spend a lot of time learning, and I'm much richer because of that. So I'm very appreciative to my liberal arts education. So in that learning, I took some very difficult English courses, and one of the writers that we studied was a person by the name of James Joyce. James Joyce is an iconic author, lived just a century ago, and I just like to make the observation is one of the books that we studied with him was called A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Right? Anybody read it? Read a portrait of an artist, right? It's a very complex book. I find it very depressing to read personally because a lot of these gifted people are very depressed people themselves. That's how they get their art. And it's interesting is that if you read the book and you study it you're not just as like reading it before bed, but you actually study the book. what you realize is that he changes his voice as he describes himself autobiographically as a child and as he is as an adult, which means it's not just that he's saying, "Oh, I'm going to tell you the history of my life from 50 years ago." What he does is as he's a child, the sentence structure is different than when he's describing himself as an adult. All right, so meaning the sentences are shorter. There's more wonder and curiosity in his diction, right, than when he is an adult. Which means to say, as he changes, he's able. It's a big gift to change the way he describes reality as a child, right? So that's within one book. But even if you go a little further, I just did this as for fun, and I mentioned this when we discussed this sort of shishto. I thought it was amazing. If you read Dubliners is really fascinating. It's like short stories, and it traces the human life through various different short stories, from death and birth all the way through to death again. And like to various different short stories. And again, there's different, very interesting as to what holds them all together. This was he released in 1914. Here's the first chapter of Dubliners. It's one of his short stories. Listen to this. There was no hope for him this time. It was the third stroke. Night after night I had passed the house. It was the vacation time, and studied the lighted square of the window. And night after night I found it lighted in the same way, faintly and evenly. If he was dead, I thought, I would see the reflection of the candles on the darkened blind, for I knew 2 candles must be set by the head of the corpse. He had often said to me, I am not long for this world, and I thought his words idle. Now I knew they were true. Every night I gazed up at the window, and I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It had always sounded strangely in my ears, like the word gnomon, from the Euclid, and the word simony in the Catechism. But now it sounded to me like the name of some maleficent and sinful being. It filled me with fear, and yet I longed to be nearer to it and to look upon its deadly work. Beautiful writing, just as a description of it. He's sort of trying to figure out if the person in the room that he passes every night has died. That's sort of his experience. And then I can fast forward to the next page, it's on page 6. You take Finnegan's Wake, which is one of his last writings in 1939, and now just listen to this over here. And this is I did not change the writing, I did not change the capitalization of the writing right now. This is Finnegan's Wake, right? Same author. River run past even Adams from swerve to shore bend of bay brings us to commodious vicus of recirculation back to Haworth Castle and environs. Sir Tristram, Villa d'Amora, forever over the short sea, had Passencore re-arrived from North America on the side of the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor to wield a fight his pensionate war. By what kind of writing is this? How would you describe this? It's called Stream of Consciousness. It's a different form of writing. Stream of Consciousness, and he is really good at Stream of Consciousness. He has a book called Ulysses, and the book changes chapter to chapter like this, where it's Stream of Consciousness is how he's processing reality literally as he's thinking it. There's no barrier between how he's thinking and how he's writing. It's called Stream of Consciousness. So it's an exploration of experience that he's doing. Now let me ask you a question. How similar is this to Dubliners, right? Right? For just a moment. And moreover, I did an engrams analysis of these two works. Here's the engrams on page 6. The engrams analysis on page 6 of Dubliners is most similar to J.K. Rowling, secondly to Dickens, third to Dan Brown, and fourth to Charlotte Bronte. Okay, so that's the in terms of the engrams. Looking at this, look at top of page 7 is Finnegan's Wake. It's a point. It's not even a point 1. Relationship to Dan Brown, then Bronte, and then Dickens. Maybe they have only a few things in their library which they're comparing to. Maybe in this particular engram. But in the end of the day, there's not even a comparison between. Forget identifying the correct author. There's no comparison between the two texts. And you know what? As academics, all we do is we study this and we look at it and we say, "Wow, this is a very gifted author." Right? This is an author who's able to change not just what he's talking about, but how he describes it. And we understand as a human being, he has the capacity to change his voice, right? Because he is a gifted writer. So wait a second. So then you come back to the Bible and you say, there's different tones, there's different word usages, there's different themes. It must be the different authors. Really? You mean you can credit a 20th century poet with the ability to change tone and diction, but you can't give that assertion to God? Like meaning, like you don't give that ability for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be able to change the way He describes things in different words. I mean, like how short-sighted, how arrogant are you? Because you could be doing the same English course, studying James Joyce, and then studying documentary hypothesis, and speak out both sides of your mouth as if you think that God has the limitation of being able to do this. Yes.
If I may ask, I may have missed it. Does he believe in God?
Who?
The author?
Which one?
Whatever his name is.
Oh, Wellhausen?
Yeah.
Oh, Finkelstein. No, Finkelstein clearly not. No, Finkelstein's long. The train has left the station. But I mean, and a lot of the academic Bible study community is living in that camp. But what I would ask is like, if you believe in sophisticated authorship, you can't believe in sophisticated authorship of Hashem. Like I mean, like it's unbelievable how self deceiving this is as well. But like, let me give you an example. This is just so obvious. Like here they put in the same camp as circus. One of the things they say is the greatly debated Ark episode, right? So what's the Ark episode? The Ark episode is that if you look in Sefer Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Beis, there's two descriptions of the Aron, right? One is when it goes into Gonos, the other one is when it comes back, but David Melech brings it to Yerushalayim. Shmuel Aleph Perek Daled and Hey, and then Shmuel Beis Perek, I think Vav is when he brings it up to Yerushalayim, and is repeated again. Direyamim, the songs that and then in Tehillim, the songs that are said as they bring up to Yerushalayim. And they say, look, the academics have long pointed out that the style and the diction seems to be very different in these two episodes, and they said, yes, look at this. We compared it using the lemmagram method, and we found that in fact that Ark 1 belongs to D as opposed to DTH, and the second one is an unknown authorship. I'm like, that's great. Yeah, let me just make it just. I don't want to give away the end, but if you look at the Gemara in Bava Basra, which talks about authorship of the Torah, and the Gemara is talking about this Yudalan Beis leading to Test of Aleph. The Gemara says that the authorship of the Sefer Shmuel was Shmuel Kosov Sifrai. So Shmuel Navi wrote his book. It says, yeah, this doesn't make so much sense, right? Because he died, right? He died in Perikut Ches. So how could he write his book exactly? There's the Gemara. The Gemara is being, very intellectually honest over here. And the Gemara says, of course he didn't write the whole book. God and Nasan wrote the rest of the book because clearly when Shmuel died, he didn't write, right? He wasn't writing the rest of his life prophetically. So the Gemara acknowledges that. So you want to say like this. So you have Aaron, say version 1, and Aaron version 2 sound different. It's like, yes, there were different people writing it. There are different prophets. That's not proof that the Bible has different authors, right? I mean, that's God and Shmuel. I'm very happy that you finally discovered the reality, but that's exactly the truth. And in fact, that's what you should be doing if you have a chance, is read the introduction of the Malbim to Sefer Yirmiyahu. The Malbim takes to task the Abarbanel, and this is a very interesting debate because the Malbim bases most of his pirush on the Abarbanel. It's both stylistically and also in terms of the major theses. He doesn't acknowledge him so much in terms of he doesn't attribute. In his reduction, he does. But in one place, he really diverges with the Abarbanel is the beginning of Sefer Yirmiyahu, because Yirmiyahu is written completely different to Sefer Yeshayahu, as an example. Anybody who's learned Tanakh, spend a little bit of time learning Tanakh, you'll notice that here, I find Yeshayahu is impenetrable. It's so poetic. It's so high tier in terms of its language. It's so hard to read Yeshayahu. But you read Yirmiyahu, it's so accessible. Yirmiyahu is so accessible in terms of the words. It's much easier. The sentence structure is different in Yirmiyahu as well. Now, happens to be Yirmiyahu is written not chronologically, which is what makes Yirmiyahu hard to learn, is that it's not a chronological sefer. Why? Fascinating. Read the introduction of Dat Mikra to Yirmiyahu. But that's the difficulty of Yirmiyahu. It's not understanding the words, it's understanding the context of the words that makes Yirmiyahu harder. Yirmiyahu is so much easier. Why is that? The Abarbanel says simple. Because Yirmiyahu was a boy. It says, if you listen to Torah last week's Torah, describes that the induction to prophecy that Yirmiyahu had was when he was a young lad. If he was a young lad, he started off without the advanced diction and vocabulary because he was a child, which is why there's lots of kriyuk sivs in Yirmiyahu, because, says the Abarbanel, he wasn't proficient at speech. He started off as a child. The Bible says, Chas v'shalom. How could you say that about our prophet HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Every word was the exact word HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave, and there was no level of interpretation that was given as well. And this is a debate, is how much space do you give for the Navi's voice? This is not about Torah. Torah, everybody agrees, is mipia gvura. When it comes to the Nevi'im, there is a discussion. How much of the voice of the Navi, how much of the filter of their own character, the Aspakari Shanim era, one of the understandings of Aspakari Shanim era is they see through a hazy lens. Some people say Aspakari Shanim era is when you have dirt on a lens, what happens is you see yourself. It reflects you. as opposed to seeing through it, which means is to the degree there's character of the prophet, and yes, he spends his life working on himself to eradicate that, but no prophet except for Moshe Rabbeinu managed to completely remove his character, and therefore the reflection is himself that he's looking through, which even reflects itself in the words. So we understand that. And that's a really fascinating discussion and debate, which is had at the beginning of Sefer Yirmiyahu. But I'd like to do one example, and I did this a little bit in Nach, as we learned a little bit on Thursday. I want to just give you an example, just to understand the profundity of this, and I would say that the arrogant simplicity that is taken by people who don't appreciate this. So let's start off over here. Is really just we're learning Sefer Yeshua on Thursdays, but it has just a very simple observation, and it's not so simple. But listen to this incredible insight. So in Sefer Yeshua, we hear about this incident where the nation of Israel crosses the Jordan River, and as soon as they cross the Jordan River, they start eating from the Avur Haaretz, right? They start eating from the crops of the land, and at that point in time, then it describes it as follows. And take a look on page 8. So they're on the outskirts of Jericho. They're eating the thing, and I apologize to those who are here for the Yeshua share. I want to just describe this because it's so important. It says, so on that day, the next day following the day of Pesach, they ate the grain of the land. And the manna ceased from that next day when they ate from the Avur Haaretz, and they ate from the produce of the land. Great. This is what's described here as well. So already the Mefarshim point out, the Ralbag says over here, is clearly over here, this is an answer to the Sadducees. What does he mean? So the Ralbag is saying a very profound point. What does it mean Mimocharas HaPesach? This is a debate that the Malbim, the Metzuras, everybody has over here. Technically speaking, the word Pesach usually refers to which day in the calendar? Yudalid, actually, because that's the day you brought the Korban Pesach. But a number of the Mefarshim point out that it refers, in this case, to the eating of the Pesach, which was on what day? Tesvav, which means that the Mimocharas HaPesach must mean the 16th, which is really helpful because the Torah talks about this date very explicitly. As an example, take a look in source in the middle column, which is Vayikra. This is what we'll call, according to the nonsense description that we described before, and P. This is priestly, right? So this is the priestly section of the Torah. So it has nothing to do with Yeshua because that's DT, right? Different author, according to their theory. But let's come back to that. So here's what it says. So when you come to the land which I'm giving to you, this is a prophecy about coming to the land of Israel in Parshas Emor. You're going to bring the Omer, the first of your harvest, to the priest, to the Kohen. Okay, good. And you're going to wave it, and then it says there, and the day after the Sabbath, they're going to shake it, so they're going to do this whole procedure. Okay, good. And you bring this. Okay, so then it says, you're not allowed to eat any grains before this day. This is what we call the notion of chadash, right? So there's a notion of this is the idea of bringing the Korban Omer on the 16th of Nisan, and only on that day can you eat all the grains from the previous year. Okay, good. Then this is what's called counting of the Omer. We count from the day the Omer sacrifice is born, which is the first of the barley grain, and then we count 7 weeks from there, 49 days. Great. That's what it said. The Sadducees says, well, technically speaking, it says Mimacharas HaShabbos, on the day after the Sabbath. If that's the case, then it means to say that when does the counting of the Omer always start? On a Sunday. And therefore they had a very simple calendar. The Omer, you didn't have to have the reminders of different calendars. It was always Sunday start as the start, finishing on Shabbos, and you had your thing, your Omer. Why? Because that's what it says in the Torah, the day after the Sabbath. And the Prushim, those who are traditional, which is our camp, said no, Mimocharas HaShabbos means the day after the first day of Pesach as well. And we spent so much time debating this group. Well, if you read a little bit of Tanakh, you would realize that Tanakh is expanded already because it says, what is Mimacharas? Do they eat from the land? When did they come into the land of Israel? This is the first time. This Perek in Yeshua is when they first entered the land of Israel. What did they do? Mimacharas HaPesach. On the day after Pesach is when they started eating me'avur aretz. How could they eat from me'avur aretz if they hadn't yet been brought the korban omer, which is the first of the grain? So this is the same day when they ostensibly are bringing the korban omer to eat from tefuas aretz, and it's described as mimacharas haPesach. So clearly, Yeshua is being mefarish, is explaining what the Torah means when it says mimacharas haShabbos. That's what the Ralbag is saying. But it's much more profound than that. Why is that? Because if you think about it for a moment, we know that this is the moment of transition between what's called lechem min hashamayim to lechem min haaretz, right? In fact, there's a tshuva which is written about what the bracha they said on the man was, and the bracha was hamotzi lechem min hashamayim. Now this is hamotzi lechem min haaretz. That transition happened when? On what day? The 16th of Nisan. The manna ceased on the day they started. The day after they started eating me'avur haaretz. Excellent. But here's the thing. We know that, in fact, the manna didn't fall every day for 40 years. We know that it only fell for 6 days a week. How do you know that? Because you look in Sefer Shmois, it describes in the third the column on the left. So they said, well, there's double portions today on Friday. Why is that? He says, no, Shabbos Kodesh Machor Asher Toifu Ves Asher Tavashlu Veshelu Ves All Kol Adem Nichol Lachem Lemishmer Salaboiker. This is going to be what's called Shabbos. Now, the word Shabbos over here, we understand is a day of rest. But that's not really what it's meaning over here. In actually the translation, it means day of cessation. It means the day that the manna stopped falling, right? Because that's why it's going to be double on Friday. Now, it happens to be that word Shabbos appears in Sefer Yoshua as well, right? Did you notice that? It's the same word, right? It says, Vaishbois Hamon Bayom Ha'u, right? It says the Mimacharas. The manna ceased on that day. It wasn't resting. It stopped falling. Now, which means that when the Torah tells us in Parshas Emor that when you come into the land of Israel, right, that when you enter into the land of Israel, you're going to do on the Mimacharas HaShabbos, what does that pasuk really mean now? It doesn't mean on the day after Saturday. That's not what it means. It means Mimacharas HaShabbos as the cessation of the man. How do you know that's what it means? Is because the Torah already told us there's going to be a time when the manna stops, called Shabbos, right? And now there's going to be the end with a capital E, in which it's no longer going to fall whatsoever. That's called Vayishboy Saman. You don't know what it is yet because you're still in the desert. There's going to come a time, that day you're going to bring the Omer, and that's when you're going to allow the new Chodesh, which is precisely what happened as they entered the land of Israel. Right, and in fact, even more than that, the profundity of this is what was the measure of the man? How much would you be able to take per person? In Shmois it says, Omer lagul goyles. It's an Omer. What is the name of the korban which is brought on the day that the manna ceased historically? Was the Omer, which means that if you think about what this means is, why is it in Parshas Emor do we bring the korban Omer? Every year? The answer is because when you come into the land, the manna is going to cease. Miwacharas HaShabbos. And in order to remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sustains you from day to day to day, you're going to bring a korban every year, and all the grain, you're going to go into the supermarkets, and you're going to have to check where the grain product came from to remember that Hashem gave you lechem min hashamayim all these years, which means the korban ha'omer and sfiras ha'omer in a certain sense is relating back to this moment that happens in Sefer Yoshua. But if these are all three different authors, because one is Shmois, one is Vayikra, and one is Yehoshua, like the argument in this academic thing, then how's this all relating? These are separate people writing different histories, right? It's very, very clear. This is just one example of learning, is if you look very carefully through the three different Sfarim, they all relate to each other, they speak to each other in all the differences. Bereshis Aleph, Bereshis Beis. You need to have intellectual propriety to understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks to us in sophisticated, subtly different ways, because through that we understand it. This is one example. We just learned this last week. I thought this was an appropriate opportunity, not just to defend ourselves as Torah Jews, but to actually learn a little bit of Torah a little bit together and appreciate the complexity of this as well. So I appreciate that people have found a new tool to advance their theories, but a little bit of humility is required when dealing with the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I appreciate everybody's time and patience for joining us today.